Hello, welcome to this premium podcast where we're talking about monarchy, whether it is good or bad, really, I suppose. And on the kind of Republican side, although albeit I'm a somewhat lukewarm Republican, I'm not here sharpening my guillotine. It is me, Josh, and then I'm joined by Carl, who is defending Queen and Country, which...
Honestly, I'm somewhat of a lukewarm monarchist, to be honest. You know, like I can see the arguments for republics, but I can also see the arguments to have the monarchy. So
I would like to clarify that I've got nothing against Queen Elizabeth. I mean, I think she's dealt with things relatively well so far, and I really liked Prince Philip. I think he had lots of funny things to say, and he was clearly just a good guy. So I don't necessarily despise them. I'm not calling for their death like some kind of Frenchman.
that's based on your sentimental feelings towards the individuals, though, right?
Yes.
Not on the institution of the monarchy.
I think you should be able to judge particularly monarchs or leaders based on who they are as a person rather than the institutions surrounding them, because that's just the circumstance in which they inherit. But how they carry themselves is how we should judge people, both morally and otherwise, I suppose. But of course, the Queen has not always been very apolitical, let's say, as in she's meant to be. That's how our constitutional arrangement sets it up. But we have the Queen here talking about things like the COP26, where she's saying, "Act now for our children," which she was urging world leaders. And she says the time for words have now moved to the time for action. She urged the world leaders to act for our children and our children's children and to rise above the politics of the moment. So
easily refute that with the birth rates, can't we?
We can indeed. Well, obviously, our current monarchy is not necessarily perfect. Otherwise, this would not have happened. But obviously, you're not arguing that, and I'm not going into...
No, but the thing is, historically, the monarch wasn't apolitical. They were the ultimate executive authority in the land, and technically she still is. That's the thing. So it, like, you know, Boris Johnson asks her to sign something and she signs it in much the same way the president does in the United States. So it's not so very different. The only question is, how did one come to the office, really? Obviously, with Queen Elizabeth, she inherited it, whereas a president is elected. But the point is that it's not supposed to be an apolitical office, because it's not. It's the most political office, in fact. And it was the political nature of the monarch that prevented the kind of partisan politics that we see today.
But, I mean, at the minute, this is directly from the royal website, the Queen has to remain strictly neutral with respect to political matters.
Yes, it's because she's meant to represent the whole kingdom and not one faction within the kingdom. But when she starts doing that, then she gives license to factions that could, say, oppose the monarchy, that she is still technically representing. And then so she's created a breeding ground for civil war here, or an overthrow.
I would be very surprised if people are going to start a civil war over this climate stuff, although it is getting
I'm not saying
annoying.
They will, but the point is it's a strange thing to permit, right? To say, well, okay, yeah, I'm going to allow those people who want to literally chop off my head to be political actors, elect parliamentarians, and then agitate for the destruction of the station I occupy. Like, why would you do that?
I do agree, yeah. It doesn't necessarily seem particularly good on their part to do that.
It's kind of foolish. And this is one of the points that Burke was making about the French Revolutionary. So why would anyone want any of you in their country if your demand is to come and chop off the king's head? The king's going to say, just no. Go away.
Yeah, I mean, when you're making demands of someone, generally your demand being that you kill them, no one's going to agree to that.
Or even dispossess them of something that they've inherited by right. You know, because no one questions that Elizabeth isn't the lawful monarch of England, because she is. And so she's inherited this by right. And now a bunch of people who've got a bunch of ideas in their heads are saying, well, actually, because we have some ideas, we're going to take that away from you. It's like, but what did she do wrong? The thing that she did wrong was being born in this line of succession. She didn't act in any way wrong. You know, there's no legal justification for any of this. And yet that's what a bunch of diehard Republicans would do. And so where is their claim to right coming from?
I think that the more reasonable Republican argument here would be that it's not necessarily that she inherits, maybe some kind of symbolic position. Obviously, she can have her possessions, so not take away Buckingham Palace from the monarch, for example. That's That's what the French do, and we are not the French by.
But the thing is, this seems like the thin edge of the wedge, right? As in, yeah, that's a reasonable argument that can be made by a reasonable Republican, but that behind that reasonable Republican are a bunch of frothing at the mouth Labour voters who are going to agitate further and further and further. And once the first concession has been made, then why wouldn't the rest of the concessions be made?
Because in Britain, in the past 1,000 or so years, we've not allowed radicals to take over in that same way. Normally,
it's happened a couple of times.
Yeah,
Cromwell.
few blips here and there, but I think that we would be more likely to progress towards a gradual reform. I think that's more in our culture than otherwise.
It is, but to be a little more abstract about it, because, okay, we might be a special case here, but I mean, anywhere else isn't going to be the same special case. And once the monarch has essentially accepted the legitimacy of the rational argument from the people who have some ideas, then they've essentially delegitimized themselves as being the inheritor of an ancient tradition. I don't see why they would agree to that.
Well,
I mean, it is true that the monarch is the inheritor of an ancient tradition, and with that tradition comes authority and power and responsibilities and obligations. And so to say, well, I have a series of ideas that suddenly delegitimizes you, isn't true, right? It's not true that they're not that thing. And so the argument becomes, well, we only accept your authority if you're elected. And it's like, well, A, how is that not just a form of tyranny of the majority? But B, on what grounds?
I mean, on what grounds would someone who has just inherited a title, on what grounds do they have a right to control other people? That seems to me to be very counter to liberal principles.
And so we get to the question of fatherhood.
Oh, you're not doing this, are you?
Well, it's the same argument. On what grounds, just because I have inherited the title of father by giving birth to a son, on what grounds do I get to keep that?
Well, you have a right to look after your children. I think this is a straw man of my argument.
Okay, let's explore it.
Sure. So you have a right over your own children. I think I'm obviously not disputing that. And I think it's putting words in my mouth.
You say you're not disputing it, but there are pro-Republican sympathizers who indeed do make that argument. I mean, the French revolutionaries made the argument. All of the communists make the argument. There's someone in California at the moment currently making that argument. That I've got an article that I'll cover on the podcast at some point with. And we've covered the feminists, of course, want to abolish the family entirely. And this comes out of the sort of French revolutionary Republican politics, because it does seem that once you refuse that chain of logic, then that can be applied to any circumstance.
Well, allow me to explain it slightly differently.
Go ahead.
So my kind of initial kind of reaction against there being monarchy, my ideal situation would be that monarchy ceased to be after Queen Elizabeth dies. That would be what I would want. I'm willing to, out of respect for what she has done, like I said, I'm not frothing at the mouth Republican. I'm willing to say, okay, fine, you can hold your position. But when it comes to Charles, I'm not willing to. Sure,
but I'm talking about the institution rather than the people who occupy it. I mean, what would you replace it with?
I don't, because at the minute it serves more of a symbolic role. They don't necessarily. Basically, Parliament and Whitehall basically run their own sort of show, don't they? Other than, obviously, we've got the judiciary as well. But that system, more or less, basically hands the legislation symbolically to the Queen. She's never refused to sign a piece of legislation into law because she recognises the supremacy of Parliament as the ultimate governing body.
And that's an unresolved constitutional question as well. What are the limits of Parliament? Well, I mean, they locked us all in our homes and shut down every business. Maybe we should have limits on Parliament. Maybe there shouldn't be. I'm
all for limited government. Don't worry.
well, yeah, me too. But that's the point, isn't it? Like the Edmund Burke put it in this way. He was like, look, it's easier to graft on Republican institutions into a monarchy than monarchical institutions into a republic. And there are values and virtues in monarchical institutions that are very difficult to find in republics. And it's very difficult to introduce these into the republic, because the republic is generally a kind of roiling mass of competition that never ends up resolving. You know, it resolves into a tyranny, frankly. You know, they all end up resolving into a dictatorship. Whereas monarchies don't all end up resolving into dictatorships because of the republican institutions that can be grafted into the monarchy without destroying the institution itself.
If republics always result in dictatorships, when did America become, well, you might be saying, well, but when did America become a dictatorship? I mean, they've had a long time to...
Yeah, it takes about 250 years.
Okay.
We've got quite a few good examples of this as well, the most obvious one being the Roman Republic. But yeah, somewhere between 250 and 300 years before essentially power ends up coalescing because there's a constant competition between different factions. One faction eventually wins.
But is competition not good? Because in every other domain, competition is seen as a positive thing because ultimately it brings out the best if you are looking to get the most effective at what they're competing for. If there is no competition, then things become
I'm not saying not having any competition, but this is like the extreme of having nothing but competition. The problem with republics that we're seeing at the moment in the United States is a total breakdown of sentimental bonds between the Republicans and the Democrats. They are just people who are two warring factions at this point that just occupy the same spot of land. They don't see themselves as the loyal opposition. Right?
But one thing,
hang on.
sorry.
So it's not that there are different kinds of competition. Like if you have two people who are on the same team and competing to be the best, that's not destructive. You know, they're not looking to annihilate the other person. They're just looking to supersede them. Whereas in the case of a republic, if you're literally just bound together by a social contract, then why wouldn't you want to destroy the people who you see as being essentially illegitimate and occupying your territory illegitimately?
But I don't necessarily see how a monarchy could solve that situation, particularly in the United States. I think that things have devolved to the point, not necessarily that you just kind of throw in a monarch now per se, but it doesn't seem like the problems could be solved simply by having a shared monarch, for example.
Well, I mean, eventually they're going to be solved by a dictator either way, because that's the fate of republics. But I'm not saying that we could just say, well, there's a king of America now, and then that's the end of that problem. Maybe it's an irresistible path that they have to walk down, you know? But the thing is, I think, and this is what I think most people fail to understand about monarchies, is they are not merely about politics. They build bonds of sentiment between the different classes of society. And very often in history, the monarch is the defender of the common people against the aristocracy. Right. And so, and whatever class is occupying, whatever we call the class that occupies these stations in life, but the third estate against the second estate against the king. And so it's about balancing power, but it's also about bonds of oaths and obligations and sentiments, as in you bind together in something like a family. It's not just people who happen to live near each other and who are bound by laws and rules. These are bonds of sentiment. These are emotional.
Well, I don't think that there is this personal relationship with a monarch because, as far as I'm concerned, probably many of my ancestors have fought, potentially died on behalf of the country in which we live in, and yet they're fighting on behalf of the king, or the queen in some cases. But do they really get much in return for that?
Well, they're protecting
their family, but it's not about the monarch. They're doing it for the people. They're doing it for the life they live. And sure, you could attribute that to the monarch, but is it?
Well, I don't
is
think
it necessary that you do these things?
I don't think you can split them out, right? These are all things that are bound up together in a very complex web of relationships that eventually comes to encompass the entire civilization. And so the civilization takes on a sort of continuity through time and space. And it seems that you're focusing on like one slice of this in the current here and now, and saying, well, look, I'm not bound to this continuity and I can just explode it at my whim. And I'm not sure that you can, and I'm not sure it's right to do that. And you are imposing your will on those people who don't want that.
Well, I'm not saying that there should be some kind of republican tyranny either. I mean, I believe in principles of
republics
democracy.
begin with tyranny.
Do they?
Yes.
Is it a necessary feature?
Yes.
You reckon?
Yes. Hundreds of thousands of Americans fled to Canada because they were loyalists. All of the aristocracy of France fled or got executed. Look at any 20th century African country a republic coming into existence. They all are birthed in tyranny.
Talking of tyranny, actually, I think if we could go on to some of the stuff about who the next monarch of England will be, John.
Okay.
I'm really.
This
is a bit of a cheap tactic. I am sorry.
Well, there are good and bad monarchs, but
it's just the next.
There are
thing,
just
John.
bad politicians.
So obviously, the next monarch is going to be Prince Charles, and he is basically bought and paid for by the World Economic Forum, isn't he?
Just like Joe Biden.
Yes.
And Boris Johnson.
Yes.
And many other elected leaders.
But why do we need more? Basically, more government. That's essentially the political role. I know you're saying it's more than politics, but the politics is the thing that I'm concerned about.
But the government...
If they're...
Sorry, just this is the thing. But the government has never been bigger than it is now.
Well, I want it to be smaller, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, if you were to look back in history, you would... I mean, no European monarchy has ever had a state the size of the state that we have now. It'd be mad. And the advantage of having a monarch is that the government can be represented in the person of a king. So people can point and say that guy is the problem. Whereas if you've just got this giant decentralized state that is puppeteering over the entire civilization, it's hard. And if you get rid of the president, okay, well then a new president comes in. He inherits the deep state that owns everything and nothing changes. So you still get the continuity just with a figurehead who doesn't have as much power nearly as they would need to undo the entire civilization, the entire circumstance. And this is why the American government just keeps growing and growing and growing.
Well, surely the quality of governance is determined by the virtues of the people who make up the system.
God, then we're in trouble, aren't we?
I know, yeah. Well,
I can't.
I didn't say I was optimistic.
Can you think
it.
of a single virtuous politician in a republic?
There are good politicians in the States.
Ron Paul?
The kind of the more liberty inclined people, the people who respect the Constitution, they do exist.
But they're not winning, are they?
No. Well, I mean, I don't want to say it's the American people voting because then that will
trigger a lot of angry comments. Yeah, no, but
it's obviously but this, in ordinary circumstances.
But this is the problem, though. I think the reasoning around republics is actually not as concrete as it could be, and the understanding of monarchy is a bit shallow. And so you get to these. Well, we'd get more intelligent and meritorious or virtuous men in republics. So yeah, okay, but we can look at republics and see that hasn't happened. And so whatever the reasoning was that led us up to that point is clearly faulty.
Maybe, but my main objection really to monarchy is that it endows one person who is a fallible person. They're not any more special than anyone else, with an amount of power, both in theory and potentially in practice, in that a monarch could take over in Britain and order the military to arrest all of Parliament, all of the government, and I mean that would be. I know I'm not making my case very well.
Yeah, the ideal circumstance. Carry on, Josh.
But the
monarch's going to put all the parliamentarians up against the wall. I'm listening.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.